We have three co-chairs. We have three co-chairs in the group. I am Kathleen Gregory. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Scholarly Communications Lab in Canada and also a research fellow at the Data Archiving and Network Services in the Netherlands. And Fotis and Ming, do you want to introduce yourselves? Okay, and then we're
Hi everyone. I'm Ming Fang Wu, working for Australia Research Data Commons as a data specialist. Over to you, Fotis.
All right, and hi everyone. My name is Fotis. I am a researcher at the Institute of Applied Biosciences at CERF in Thessaloniki, Greece, and mostly active in bioinformatics and machine learning.
Nice. And so we are the three co-chairs for this group. And we have previously had a fourth co-chair, Suryoda Khalsa, and he recently resigned his position as a co-chair, but we just wanted to take a second and really recognize all of his great efforts for our group in the past, but he will not be with us today. Let's go ahead and advance the slides. So as Fotis said, we are recording the session. So if you do not want to be recorded, please turn off your camera and microphone. The recordings will be available for all of the sessions at RDA for 4 weeks in the Whova platform. And then after that, they'll actually be made available on YouTube. So you'll be able to have access to this session if you need to catch up on anything, but also other sessions. Fotis has already shared the notes in the chat, but if you need the link here, we have them as well. And we just ask that you add yourself to the list so we have a record of everyone who is here and also so that we can follow up with you. And hopefully continue the conversation as you may be interested in it. And also, of course, we have the Twitter handle there if you'd like to tweet any of our findings that we have here from this discussion today. So this is the agenda for our talk. In our session, we will begin just by going over kind of the group's history and the progress that we've made over the past years that we've been active. Just for those of you who are new to the session and new to the group. And then we'll spend the bulk of the time thinking about kind of new directions and new task forces for the group. So we'll do that by each giving a kind of introduction. Both Ming, Fotis, and myself will give a little pitch or an introduction about some possible topics for the group to focus on. And then we're looking forward to a really collaborative session where we can brainstorm ideas about these task forces, potential task forces, and directions that we can take our group in. Then we'll kind of wrap up in the last 20 minutes or so with hopefully some nice, practical, actionable items to move us forward in the group. So just a little bit of history on the background of how our group started. We really have the goal of addressing the F, findability and the fair data principles here. Specifically F3, where the point that says metadata are registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So the keywords there are being indexed and searchable. And that kind of defines our focus and has defined our focus for the past few years. I keep saying few years. I'm not sure exactly how many years we've been going here. So this next slide we developed to highlight the different key players in the data discovery process. So we have the data providers who are, of course, providing the data or the content that needs to be searched, as well as often providing metadata and descriptions of the data or other data attributes that eventually users might need as their search, which can be used for searching data, but which users might also need to make decisions about data, to evaluate data for potential reuse. We also have the data discovery service providers here, who essentially are choosing what data to index. They're developing algorithms and approaches for ranking that data, developing search interfaces which users would interact with as they are then searching for data. And then, of course, the third group here, which I've mentioned, and all of the other two are the users, the potential researchers, maybe other people who are actually engaging in the practice of searching for data in order to meet some type of data need. So some type of purpose for using the data in their work or in their teaching or for another type of purpose. So the objective of our group then is to approach the issues involved in discovering data from the perspective of all of these different stakeholders, to keep them in mind as we're exploring these shared issues and thinking about what we can do to improve data discovery across these different stakeholders, and provide a kind of a place for all of these different representatives or people from these different stakeholder groups to come together and explore these issues. But we don't, even though we are an interest group and our purpose is to kind of share common interests, we also seek to produce actionable recommendations and outcomes for the different stakeholders, for data producers, for data repositories and services, and also for the users, for the people who are seeking data. So we have been actually in action since P8, which I'm not sure where that was. It wasn't Barcelona. Was it in Colorado, maybe? I don't quite remember. But this is kind of an overview here of our history and how we've kind of organized our work over these past years. So at the P8, the members of the first interest group got together and nominated some interesting potential topics to focus on. And there was a voting process, and based on that voting, there were 4 topics, which you see here, that led to 4 initial task forces. And 3 of these task forces actually produced some actionable and actionable outputs, which we can see here in the P10 timeframe. I'll just go over these really quickly. The first one, the 11 quick tips for finding research data, is geared more toward the user stakeholder group, so the people who are actually searching for data. And this is based on the premise that searching for data is a skill. And so in this article, we provide some quick tips for people to think about in order to enhance their literacy with finding data and their knowledge of how data are structured. And how data discovery works in order to have more success in finding the data that they need. And as you can see, this has been engaged with quite a bit since it was published in 2018. It's been viewed almost 20,000 times and been downloaded also 4,000 times. And it's also been integrated into different training materials, such as the CESTA materials for the social science domain. So this is something maybe that if you're looking to provide recommendations for researchers or advice for researchers, that could be a useful starting point. The second output here was a user requirement study from data repositories. So in this study, we collected 80 use cases, and 40 of them were about portal functionality. And from those use cases, there were a series of user requirements that were drawn out and abstracted to develop different recommendations for repositories about what type of functionalities could be undertaken to support users based on the use cases that we started with. And again, you can follow the link here and also see where those use cases are published. And then the third output that came out of those task forces was a survey, again, of repositories of current practices in search services. So the real focus of this survey was to figure out what ranking models each discovery service, each search services are using in their work. So there were 98 repositories that across the globe that participated. And again, you can see more details on the link here. But our motivation was to find out more about which ranking models were being used by repositories. I think the initial idea there, or a follow-up task, could be to build a test collection to run against models and set up a benchmark, which would then be used to provide advice to repositories about which models or which ranking models might be able to be used. But Mingfang, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we kind of stopped a bit short of that goal of actually doing those recommendations. And if that's not correct, please feel free to chime in here. So then that moves us to P11. So these 3 task forces then were completed at that time. And again, you can see these recommendations or these outputs that we produced summarized here on these nice cards that the RDA put out a few years ago. summarizing our outputs. So if you're looking for something quick to share with people, these cards are useful for that. Then moving on here, we have, after those task forces, I guess that puts us in the P11 to P13 timeframe. We started 2 new task forces, one on data granularity, and then also on using schema.org to enhance research data discovery. And then the schema.org group, it turned into a working group, which kicked off in the next plenary block here. And at this session, again, at this plenary, they will be actually having a session in the next breakout session in breakout 5. If you're interested, you can check that out as well. And then we added on another task force in the next set of plenaries on user studies, during which time we have been kind of drawing on the expertise in our group to share different experiences of what types of user studies we are engaging in at our various different institutions. And that task force is still ongoing. However, the data granularity task force has since transformed into a working group. And again, they are also meeting in this plenary in breakout 8. So since the last plenary in P17, we have been really working to determine new directions for the interest group and deciding on potential new task forces. So since the last plenary and a little bit before, we've ran this survey among our members and the community to determine potential areas for interest. And here we were drawing on the list of potential ideas that people brought to the initial interest group meeting back in P8, but we also added a few to the list. And in the survey, people needed to indicate if they found the topic interesting, if they would like to contribute to it, if they would like to lead this topic, or if it was just not interesting to them at all. So FOTUS ran the analysis and was in charge of distributing and running the survey, and we were able to come to some agreement and some insights about what might be interesting directions for the interest group to pursue now. So on this slide, you can see that we've ranked the results of the research according to what would be interesting and what we would have the leadership capabilities to actually follow up on. So the numbers that you see after each of these topics represent, first is how many people found it interesting, how many people would be wanting to contribute to this topic, if someone would be willing to lead the topic, or if it was just not interesting to this person. So based on kind of all 4 of these factors, we isolated 3 topics that we think would be representative of what people would like to focus on in the group. So the first topic actually combines number 1 and 2. So that would be using upper level ontologies as a way of enriching metadata and also metadata enrichment more generally. Then the second one, the topic that we think that would be interesting to pursue for the tasks for the interest group would be to investigate how to use machine learning for data discovery. And then the third topic that we decided to carry through based on the expertise in the group, as well as people who might be interested in leading it, was actually to continue the user studies task force. So that puts us at where we are here for the goal of our session. And that's really to think about these 3 different topics, the metadata enrichment, the machine learning, and the user studies, and to just brainstorm what the scope of these potential task forces might be, to think about potential tasks, and think about how we can move forward with these topics. So I think the next part, I don't know if there's anything in the chat that we want to address here before we move on to talking about these in more detail. And Photo says no. And I think, no, okay. Then the next bit, I think we will just move on and the 3 of us will just give a pitch about each of these different topics before we move on to talking about them in more detail. So as you're listening, please feel free to put ideas in the chat. Think about what you might want to add to the discussion later on. And I will pass it over then to Ming to do the first kind of pitch. And do you want me to just drive the slides, Ming?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Yes, I will give a pitch about the metadata enrichment for data discovery. Hopefully, after my 5 minutes talk, you will through more ideas and join the force. Next slide, please. So the metadata play an important role in data discovery. It allows data sets to be discovered by relevant categories versus, just keyword search. Bring similar data sets together, distinguishing dissimilar data sets, and also have trace related data sets. And the list can go on. However, the manually creating and updating metadata is not efficient and may introduce inconsistency and omission. And in some cases, for some data sets or the resources, metadata are just not there, missing. Next, please. So metadata enrichment is a process of you take input from existing metadata or digital objects, then put as an input to workflow and a set of enrichment tools, and as output, you have an enriched metadata record or create metadata record. In that process, it may use external data sources, but not always the case. The process can be run manual, automated, or semi-automated. So next, please. I will give 3 examples that metadata could be enriched. The first one is subject metadata. So subject metadata is very general ones. It's about the topicness of a resource. It exists almost in all metadata schemas. The data shown here is stats from Research Data Australia, a service provided by Australia Research Data Commons. So in our service, we support a number of subjects, subject metadata through a number of controlled vocabularies from very discipline-specific ones to general ones. So the left list bar shows we have about 140K metadata records for data sets. Yet, if you look at the third bar, we have only half of those metadata records annotated with asterisk for subject vocabulary. That is the classification code for used widely by Australia and New Zealand research sectors. If half of that catalog records does not annotate with that classification code, then those records will miss a chance to be included in facet search, facet filter, and such. So, yeah. Next example, please. So this second example is about the spatial coverage of data. It may not exist in all, but certainly in most of metadata schemas. So the instruction usually from those schemas allow for a text string or coordinates of geographical areas. So if for those provide coordinates, is that possibility we can convert that into names. so that to support the keyword search. So for those record provide text without coordinates, can we annotate with coordinates? Then so we can support map search and structured queries. And also geographical names keep changing, from streets to country names, because various reasons is keep changing. And there are local unofficial unrecognized nickname for street name, village, and also same place are named different in different languages. So each of these could be enriched by alternatives. Next, please. The third example is the image or video annotation. On the left side, people usually want to annotate the entity, people, cars in this image, but it could be, what's the building behind that, what's the street, this event happens at that time, provide more contextual information of those entities. For historians, when they get images about the lines, so they also want to go further to identify is a line as in that image a symbolic of vigilant rulers, for example. Next, please. So that's examples. You may have more examples there, and many user cases. That's we want to discuss, use this time to discuss how we can what is the suggested scope here, just through a couple of ideas. For example, identify existing resources as an import or process, or any other resources, and what's the purpose and the problem trying to addressing, and etc. And also what's the challenges and the difficulties when apply when we enrich metadata. And also, when we have that in scope, what is the potential tasks this task forces can carry on forward? Okay, that's all from me, and over to you.
All right, so that would be me now. Right, so kind of a whiplash from the metadata, but still on the topic of data discovery. The next topic that has been identified is about connecting machine learning to data discovery. So next slide, please. Just to provide some context, and I know I'm saying this in advance, I know that I'm oversimplifying a lot of the points here, just to make a point. If you're talking about data discovery, basically what you're aiming for is to understand the data sets on hand in order to facilitate data integration, data analysis, or both. Again, fully aware that I'm really oversimplifying the process of data discovery. Until fairly recently, a lot of this work was done manually, be that at the curation level, or be that at the literally, I want to find the most relevant data for myself. So I'm looking for that, I'm trying to find, clean it up, connecting, and so forth. So right now, with the advent of machine learning, this definition of data discovery has been extended to actually include the automation of the whole process. Interaction by a human being might be mostly at the end site, after having a presentation of the data, after having all the connections in place, to provide the assessment, to provide the actual knowledge and expertise of the underlying information. But this also means that a lot of the data discovery process is being automated in a way that it's not really transparent to the end user. The end result is that if you're looking at a good application of machine learning, an appropriate application of machine learning, if you like, The major challenge right now is to ensure that the data they're using is actually of a good quality. And here, good quality, I say it in the most broader of terms, not necessarily in terms of the actual quantity, but also in terms of the biases that are included, the underlying distributions, the representation that is inherent to any kind of data, and so forth. So the good quality of the part, the good quality of the data is a critical element of effectively applying machine learning. And looking at the literature, you'll find that this is a common sentiment across all those points. So, which brings me to next slide, please. What could be potentially the context here? So, looking this at the data discovery, the first question is who might be the target audience, the roles that we're looking at. So the data consumer could be from the data scientist, the data citizen, the developer, any kind of a person of a role that is actively looking to automate the process of data discovery for their own means. But the common aspect in this role is always sort of quite similar. To find the relevant data, like step one, make sure that it's actually of a good enough quality to clean it up, which is 90% of the time, especially in life sciences where I'm from. Cleaning data is sort of the most hard thing to do. And after doing that, trying to find the relation between different data sets, the data integration part. Again, with a life science hat on, this is one of the most relevant pieces of information, looking, for example, in multiomics and so forth. So these two pain points both are elements that are underneath the discovery process. So what can be done? If we're looking at the learning process of machine learning, and what we can be looking here is how data is being used, and do an automated semantic mapping, for example, between different data sets, so that this can be effectively done afterwards by a person. In terms of the automation, and again, building on the learning process, there can be more effective recommendations. So if you're looking for data and searching, having an effective way of recommending that, look, this is possibly the data that you're looking for, it's definitely one example. Automation of linking of data sets, the data integration, again, it's a clear challenge. The benefits, I think, are a bit more evident. If you have an effective model and an effective automated process for data discovery, it means that the underlying data are more easily accessed and technically and hopefully more widely used. The second benefit, which is in my mind the more critical one, is that ultimately it provides easier interpretability of the data itself, because the process that they are discovered and they are integrated is more clear and more effective. It means that technically, again, the end result should be more easy to interpret as an insight. So, which brings me to the actual pitch so that I can close this up. So there are several viewpoints of how we can effectively see data discovery here. So you can see it from the perspective of a researcher who's actually setting up this machine learning pipeline so that different data sets, different points of interest, different items of interest are identified. So really the workflow design process. On the other hand, the fact that these workflows exist doesn't mean anything if the repositories do not actually adopt them and use them. So another viewpoint is, what are the requirements, expectations of the repositories that would like to adopt and implement those automated or semi-automated processes. And finally, you also have the scientific community. And the scientific community in general wants to ensure that any data discovery process is, for lack of a better word, good, which means effective use of data. If there are any biases, they are clearly highlighted or ideally removed, making sure that it is transparent what is actually happening, so there's no black box information, and so forth. So all those points are different viewpoints of machine learning in data discovery. So in closing, similar to slide of Ming-Fang's slide, If we are looking at a task force here, which would be about machine learning solutions for data discovery, I just realized that the title of the slide is wrong. I will fix that shortly. The scope could be, for example, a landscape analysis. What are the existing solutions? Because there are machine learning solutions that facilitate data discovery. Let's look at what these are, what they do, what they can effectively offer. Another approach, another task, another perspective would be to focus on the methods. How can we describe or how we can share these machine learning models that have been trained for data discovery? If we're talking black box model, it's not as easy to describe or share. So it means that we have to start thinking about best practices, standards, recommendations, and so forth. And ultimately, we can also look at the mechanisms, how we can ensure that the repository can ensure that these workflows can be applied without any biases underlying. So these are, again, different perspectives of the same task force. They're not mutually exclusive, but tackling them all at the same time, you can hopefully understand that it's going to be a bit of a challenge. So looking at tasks, again, we can take that one task would be to do the landscape. Another task and an outcome would be to have a best practices document. So what I would like to have out of this session after the discussion we'll have shortly, if find people who are interested in this task force, first of all, and ideally interested in actually leading and contributing to that. See what is the agreed scope of that, refine it, and make sure that we really pinpoint what we can reasonably achieve, identify the tasks, and of course, find the leads. And with that, I'll move on I'll give the floor to Kathleen.
Nice. Well, thank you, Fotis, and thanks, Ming. I have the pleasure to introduce the last topic for discussion, and it's something that would continue the work of our existing task force on user studies, but taking it perhaps to the next phase. So as we know here, there are many different search portals and search solutions that are being developed to help people find data at the national level, such as different implementations of Dataverse. On the left-hand side, you see the implementation of Dataverse NL for the Netherlands, or for example, in Australia at the Research Data Australia repository, but also we have, of course, more global perspectives, such as Google Dataset Search. So all these different search solutions are being developed, but at the same time, we are still learning about how people are actually engaging in this process of finding data, how they are using the data that they find and making decisions about whether those data will be useful in their work, and the different criteria about those data which they use to evaluate data and understand data. So even though we're developing search solutions, at the same time, some of those search solutions are being developed without a really good understanding of the practices of different users in different communities. So this was kind of the driving impetus for the task force, which we had ongoing before. And it's also supported by this results that we did from the past survey of different repositories, which Ming Fang led. And here we found that there were 98 repositories, I believe, that participated in this survey. And 3/4 of them actually did not create or conduct any type of user evaluations for different reasons. Some of them just found the process too resource intensive. They didn't have the resources to actually dedicate to understanding their users or conducting user studies. For others, it wasn't a clear set priority. And for others, it seemed that they just believed that their search engine was doing the work just fine and meeting the needs of the users. So there is definitely room for conducting more types of user studies. And we see that these types of studies are actually increasing in recent years. But despite their increase, they seem to be scattered in different domains. Different methodologies are being used, such as search log analysis, different types of usability evaluations, ranging from those to more kind of qualitative types of research, such as interviews or more ethnographical research. And at the same time, the studies that are being conducted are being done by different actors or stakeholders in the landscape. We see studies being conducted by repositories themselves, We see studies being conducted by academic researchers, such as myself, whose interests lie in understanding how people are reusing data, and also in different infrastructure developers and providers. And here also we think of larger providers and larger search solution developers such as Google Dataset Search. These studies also though have different foci. So some of them are geared toward understanding particularly research data. Some of them make explicit that they're only looking at government data or open data portals. Of course, we know that there's much overlap between all of these data types, and all of these different data are actually used in research. But the studies that are being conducted sometimes take the perspective of a different type of data. Other studies take the perspective of just looking at data from or discovery practices or user studies only within a particular disciplinary domain, such as the social sciences or biomedicine, or they focus on different actors. For example, looking at the practices of researchers or the practices of government employees or the practices of other data professionals or data journalists even. So the point is that, one, we don't know very much about how users are actually finding their data. Two, it does appear to be a topic of interest and studies are increasing, but these studies are scattered across these different methods conducted by different people and with different foci. So as a way to start to get a handle on the studies that are being conducted about users, the task force that was ongoing in our interest group started to bring together the expertise from the interest group members. And we arranged a series of presentations here, which you can see, I think we had a list of 8 to 10 different presenters, and the slides are also linked here, that use these different methods and exhibited these different perspectives. So we did this as a way to start to gain an overview of the studies that are being done and also to bring them together. However, this series of presentations was run, I think, about a year ago now. And we feel that there's kind of room to move on from that, to move on from the expertise that exists in our group and that we kind of brought together a year ago, and to try to think about how we can speak across all those different studies and bring them together and try to isolate common findings from across this kind of scattered perspective. So the suggested scope here, and my very short pitch will end, is to think about how we can expand that list, one, of those user studies which we already started to collect, and then two, to try to do some type of meta-analysis or meta-research that's bridging across those studies. So that's just some ideas for the suggested scope of continuing this user study task force. Of course, we can contribute. I would love to hear your ideas about also other ideas for the scope. But in line with that scope, I think some potential tasks for this user studies task force would be, one, to organize another series of presentations to expand that list more and learn more about what other efforts are happening in the space, or to have updates on those existing efforts, which we've already started to learn about. To continue to create a list where we're capturing all of these ideas, and then to think together about developing a plan for meta research, whether we're focusing on studies that use a particular methodology, such as interview studies and looking at findings across those, or perhaps we're looking at studies in a particular domain, or something that bridges across the different kind of scattered landscape here. So in terms of the expected outcomes for our session today, I would hope for this task force we can come to some agreement on the scope of the user studies task force, as well as iron out these different tasks, and of course, look for people among us who would be interested in taking on a leadership role in this task force. So I think with that, then we move into kind of the discussion part of our session, which should be the remainder of our time together today. So this slide is just a summary of the different pitches and the different ideas for our task forces, which the three of us have gone through, with a summary of kind of the ideas of the different scopes and potential tasks. And I think the next step here would be to start talking about these different potential task forces individually, maybe starting with the metadata enrichment task force and then moving through the list. But Fotis and Ming, do you have anything to add here about how best to proceed? Should we have people make comments in the collaborative notes? What is the next step?
So there is already some comments on topic 1, the metadata enrichment, looking at the shared Google Doc. But before we dive into that, I would like to encourage people on the chat that participate here to offer any thoughts on any of those three task forces. Specifically, the thoughts are, to make it more clear, question 1, whether you feel that these are relevant or interesting, or they should be completely scrapped. This is critical. If no one is interested in any of those, it might not be worth pursuing. Question 2, based on the scope that we've identified in each of those task forces, if you feel that something is missing or something is redundant or something should be changed. And third, which is sort of hopefully self-explanatory, whether you'll be interested in contributing and or leading any of those task forces. So, thoughts? Please feel free to unmute or just paste a type on the chat window or the Google document.
From my screen, I can Woma his hands up. Yeah, please unmute yourself.
All right. So I'm wondering about the machine learning for data discovery. I mean, is it intentional to limit it to machine learning approaches, or could that be expanded to other methods of information retrieval? I mean, I imagine that it would be useful to use other kind of more tailor-made solutions to discovery, just as well as the models that are trained based on machine learning.
All right, I can take this one. So thanks. The short answer is that already saying machine learning is broad enough. If we extend this to any type of information retrieval, in my mind, it will really broaden the scope, which means, again, I'm not going to be against that, but it means that we'll need to be extremely specific on what are the tasks that we would be looking at. So, for example, if you're talking about a landscape analysis of information retrieval, automated information retrieval solutions as a potential scope, then it might be extremely useful to really identify what we mean by automated information retrieval systems, because technically any kind of a search engine is an information retrieval system, be that an SQL query, for example, or a more complex, fully automated, fully trained machine learning model. This is the main reason that we started with a discussion with machine learning. Again, fully acknowledge that it's already big enough. But if you have a particular way, a different way of posing this as a scope, without leading into this pitfall, I'm absolutely happy to do that. And I see Leila also has a comment here. If you could share an example of the information retrieval approaches you had in mind.
I can probably find an example. I remember reading a report from the Library of Congress that summarized different approaches to improving metadata. And I don't know what definition, or I don't remember what definition they used, but that might be something to take some inspiration from.
Cool, thanks. Any other thoughts on any of those task forces? I can try putting it a different way, mostly to try to see if we can have some traction. Looking at the first one, the machine learning, the metadata enrichment one. And again, I start with this one because there is already some discussion on the shared Google document. There is a point there by Graham that scalability can be a real killer for enhanced metadata. And the discussion here is how to have structured sources, I assume, to do that. So my question is, I see this not necessarily as a challenge, but rather as a way that the topic of metadata enrichment could be further refined as terms of scope. Because right now we have the existing resources and the challenges or difficulties. Another approach would be based on this comment, and feel free to correct me if I'm really off topic here, is to discuss about what would be the relevant structures to be used in order to support metadata enrichment. And I see already a hand by Graham.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of say that we've been tackling this problem for a long period of time now, and we can sort of go back over 10 years easily. And part of it is kind of the bottom-up approach, and the other one is the top-down approach about how to kind of do this enhancement of the metadata at the discovery level. One of them is that we now have the tools to be able to scrape information from a vast number of files. We've got over 340 million files to scrape information from and feed that through to our catalog records to enhance the metadata. And then that ties in with ontologies as well to then hopefully embellish that. That's one aspect, and that really does rely on standards to make that scalable and workable. The other one, which we're struggling with, is then how to further enhance the cataloging by using machine learning to then use control vocabularies to then tag records. And we've had a go at it, and it wasn't a big go at it, but we didn't get too far with it. For us, it's about the scalability at the end of the day. We've already got a limited number of people. We're dealing with fresh data, which are coming out at a rate of knots, and also historic data. We're trying to ensure that we are able to wrap those catalog records in such a way that it's meeting the tagging needs of the community, and using those control vocabularies to then enhance the search. It's a difficult task, but it's one that's going to be done by scalability.
Thanks, Gail. I like the comment, but I'm trying to see if I can rephrase it, because the way that you did it now in my mind again, and I'm sorry, I think I'm monopolizing the discussion, but you've connected also the machine learning task force with the metadata enrichment in a very particular way. And so already I think that all these task forces are kind of connected. But based on your description, I would say that one additional scope for metadata enrichment could be about standards for ensuring that metadata enrichment can be performed. And then on the other hand, for the machine learning and discovery, the question would be, based on the standards for the metadata enrichment, what would be the appropriate, not methods necessarily, but the descriptors or even the control vocabulary that needs to be used for running a machine learning model that effectively does that?
I think what would be really useful is actually the tooling, because it's finding the appropriate tools to kind of to bridge that gap. Because I don't think we are short on the actual content to train any sort of machine learning. We know what the control vocabularies are, and they have content which we can scrape from. We know what our catalog records, and they're richly content-wise, but it's then getting the tool to kind of bridge the gap, which works when you do have some limited sources. They may be rich themselves, but they are still limited. And yeah, the approach we've taken so far didn't work. But we're still in sort of the infancy of exploring this area. So certainly kind of like learning about the possibilities, and if there's recommendations that kind of came out saying, okay, if you've got this type of problem, these are solutions which we found that work and the ones which don't work, so you don't waste your time.
Yeah,
I see.
Graham, we have an opposite problem. We don't have, for our catalog, we have we look at the top 22 categories. For example, there are, for our catalog, there are 4 or 5 categories that get most of a metadata record. And 1/3 of them, 1/3 of the categories has only like 100 or 200 of record. So when we apply a machine learning method, those have lots of records doing well, and those have few does very badly. So we would like to get a record from other repositories that can cover those, less representative categories in our catalog, so we can learn vocabulary from there, then apply to ours. Yeah. So, and also there is issues. So even we enriched record, then where that's recommendations from machine learning algorithms. It can be right, it can be wrong, but if we shown that in the user interface, say this record could be about these 3 or 4 subject areas, how about if we get 1 out of 4 is wrong, or 2 out? What's the acceptance rate from users? They can tolerate that error. So that bring question, to what is the limit machine learning metadata enrichment can do, and what the algorithm cannot do, but need the loop of human interaction. So that's probably related to third study. Yeah, it's all related kind of to each other.
Yeah, we did look at that sort of aspect as well of, okay, you can get something out of this approach, but how reliable is it?
Yeah.
But to some extent, we were also saying, okay, well, we can apply certain thresholds. That's one thing. But the other one is, if you've got very poor tagging or no tagging anyway, getting somebody in the right ballpark is a good start. So there's an acceptable level of incorrectness, as it were, which we might be willing to accept. Yes, you can change things and automate it in the future as people come back and help you to refine stuff, but it is an iterative process.
Yeah.
But to kind of get the first handle on it, we need something which is scalable, and that's why we were looking at machine learning to give us that scalability.
But I really love what Ming was saying there also about bringing the humans in the loop, but also the users in particular, right? So thinking about how you can get that feedback from the user community about the machine learning models, about whether you're in the right ballpark or whether you're totally out of it. I think that's something that is a nice overlap and connection point between all 3 of the different task forces. But I see that we also have another hand up here. So please just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak.
Ella?
Okay, I was not sure. Was not sure if I was the only raised hand.
You were at the hand. Yes, sorry.
Yeah. So I have to comment one question and one comment. The question is, having metadata and data semantically annotated open different ways for data discovery, and machine learning can be used there, but machine learning can also be used to do those semantic annotations. So my question is, in the task force 2, will you consider the 2 types of algorithms, those that are semantically annotating or semantically enriching data and metadata because they will facilitate data discovery, or will you focus on those that are doing already data discovery and possibly using semantically annotated data? Is it too confusing?
I'm not sure, to be honest. In that context, how this how this would fit between, I'm thinking that as the way that you presented that, it might be connected to both the machine learning creation process as well as the metadata enrichment, but in a very peculiar way. It almost feels like a new task force by itself, but I may be completely off here because it is so. It is. I'm not sure. I'm mumbling a bit. So we're talking about a semantic modeling of the metadata. So this is sort of creating a model to facilitate the discovery by effectively connecting the metadata of different sources through a semantic connection. So the question I have in mind is this semantic connection made by curating the corresponding metadata, or is it also created through a machine learning or information retrieval process, an automated process, if you like? If that, it means that this is another approach to be taken under the machine learning process, that as an application, as a model, it could fall and enable the metadata enrichment part. Does this make sense? I'm trying to sort of see whether I can capture this.
Yes, it's just that we have kind of two big groups of machine learning algorithms that are both of them facilitating data discovery, but in different ways. But I suppose that whether the two of them are tackled and then categorized while doing the landscape, or whether we focus first in one or the other, can be discussed during the development of the task force, during the task force. Thank you, Fotis. And I think I see someone else has a hand raised. I have another comment, but I will give the word to the other person because it might be related to these same topics. So maybe it's better to continue the discussion in here. Thank you.
Thanks, Leila. And Heinrich, please.
Yes, here's Heinrich from DKC. And as well working on EU.B2Find, the cross-domain discovery. So I think these machine learning techniques are very quite interesting, but it depends on the stage or the level of discovery and harvesting. As for example, Graham out in the CEDA, there's a great things that the people doing here, and so by they harvesting directly from the data files. So but if you come to harvesting from centers, so what we do with cross-domain discovery, so you are on the level where semantic annotations and human beings have to add. So I think we have to differ between, so this is a granularity and a stage problem, I think. On the bottom level, you can use a lot of machine learning techniques to grab and to get metadata on file level. But then if it comes to citation and authors, and so human beings and relations between, relations as well you can get from machine learning techniques, maybe. So it's a tier problem, a level problem of level of granularity, I think, where you can use which technique, and at the end, of course, human beings have to annotate and enrich the descriptive metadata. Don't know if this helps, this comment.
It absolutely helps because it also gives one additional context, which is basically how to interact with other working groups and interest group. And I know the granularity is one of the relevant working groups to that end. So is the way that you presented that, it might be also useful to see which of those new task forces could potentially be linked or have a more coherent interaction with the other working groups in RDA. And that's definitely one thing to keep in mind. So yes, thank you for that. I'm wondering, so far in my mind at least, we've been discussing mostly groups 1 and 2, but I don't think we've given any love to task force 3. So are there any, and again, in my mind, this user studies is one of the more, in quotation marks, mature ones out of the 3, mostly because there has been some discussion already to that end and some effort, as Kathleen has described before. So are there any thoughts about the third task force?
I think one thing that comes to my mind, and I won't monopolize the conversation here also, but is how this could relate, how the user studies task force could relate to the other 2 task forces. I mean, this is something maybe that we haven't really talked about in the user studies group so far. But as I said, I was kind of triggered by that comment earlier from Grant and from Ming about how we can actually involve users in the evaluation of some of these different approaches. So maybe that's also something to think about as we go forward with the task forces, is how the 3 of them actually overlap with each other and maybe look for different points of connection. So having said that, I think that's maybe one thing to look at. But I'm really curious to hear if people also see the need that we discussed earlier in the group since P17 for doing some type of meta research across these different user studies, or if that's something that is not that interesting going forward. So any feedback on that idea of kind of bringing together commonalities and themes across the different types of user studies research would be interesting. And I think I see a hand from Graham, and I can't really see the chats, but I see there's a couple of chats there. But Graham?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I left one comment in the notes for topic 3, because I think this is really, as you've outlined it, Kathleen, I think it's really interesting, some of the user studies that are there, but they are a little bit fragmented, and I would really be interested to see something going maybe across more of the disciplines, maybe slightly more comprehensive, because I feel like I'm really interested in the first 2 topics, but they just sort of bring me back to the third topic, really. If I was looking at metadata enrichment, or specifically the data discovery, I'd really need to know a bit more about the user studies, about the user tasks that are trying to be completed. And I'm coming at this from a publisher's point of view, so I think it was brilliant to presented at the last plenary around some of the really interesting studies around how just researchers in social sciences get to data, and is it dominantly via an article, is it dominantly via another data sharing platform, which for us is a really big question before we, for example, embarked on anything around a new discovery platform or enriching the metadata within the repository related to it, is what's the key way of getting to it, because we can look at almost like the articles as being items of metadata in this case. So I feel like, yeah, everything that I'm interested in this does sort of point back to this third topic for the reasons that you've outlined. And I would be keen on something that was perhaps slightly more comprehensive or tied them together somehow.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Graham. And that's great to know that you're also really interested in it and maybe interested in being involved in some of the leadership of the task force, because we're always looking for potential help and new voices in that. So what I heard you say is that it's interesting also to think about bringing together the tasks for why people are are using data, like the purposes for why people are even searching for data in the first place. So I think that's maybe one way of approaching any type of meta research is looking at common tasks and purposes that people have for data. I think another thing that's come out, just looking at those past studies that we've talked about in our group and just in other forums also, is some type of meta research about data needs, right? Which is of course related to the tasks. I think they're very, very related because of the purposes for which people use data are one of the shaping factors of their data needs. But I think that there's lots of rich, like qualitative descriptions of the data that people need in some of these past research studies that we've looked at in the group. But that what has not been really done a lot is looking at those qualitative descriptions and trying to get some type of classification of data needs, I think, across these many different studies. That could be interesting, I think, also. And that also reminds me, and then I'll stop monopolizing this bit, and I would love to see there's more action in the chat. But there was an interesting paper from Tanja Friedrich and her colleagues, actually from Germany, looking at kind of using a type of more structured approach to segment, do these descriptions of data needs, and then developing a classification system from there. So I think, again, that's more of an automated approach also to this type of qualitative analysis, qualitative data about data needs. That might be something that could be used. But again, I can't really see the chat. So if there's anything new in the chat, Fotis, would you mind moderating that?
So we maybe Catherine unshare the slides so we can see each other.
Yeah, that's a better way to go. There we go.
Yeah.
And then we see that Leila also had a chat comment earlier. Did you want to talk more about that, Leila, about involving users to test an approach?
It just came to my mind some minutes ago when you mentioned about involving users, because we use different machine learning algorithms to do different things, and the results might be different, and we really don't know how users are reacting to this. And well, one way to see how users react to one algorithm or another one is using A/B testing and user analysis. You will analyze how the user interact with something, and that is very, very common for commercial software. That is the way that they know that you, I don't know, buy jackets and boots for winter at the same time. We have worked a little bit on this, and we have seen that it is not commonly used for research-oriented information retrieval, at least not when it comes to challenges. For instance, the text retrieval challenge or the BioAsk challenge. They usually involve some sort of curated training data sets, and they don't really expose users to real production environments. It is totally out of the scope of the 3 task forces, but it just came to my mind. Maybe something for the future.
Yes, Leila, I can't remember the organization. One organization in Japan, they organize this data set track. That means they organize the resources, then research groups run their models, then most of them involved in machine learning to train the ranking models, then compare to each other which model works better. But they also, this year, I believe, they also run a user involved track. That means, you know, like A/B test you described. So if say one model is 10% of increase in precision, what does it mean to user? Compare, you know, 5% of improvement or 20% improvement, what does that mean to user? So I can't, maybe I find that link.
Wherever you find it, if you can please share it with me, I would be interested because we have been working in this subject. Thank you, Ming.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just thinking about what you said, Leila, about how it's not used well, for example, in research-oriented IR, as you were saying, but also this type of A/B testing. I mean, I would be surprised if that's used even at the repository level. I don't know if anyone has had any type of experience at their repository, if they've done testing like that as they're developing interfaces or anything along those lines, where they actually kind of doing some type of A/B testing. My guess is that would take lots of resources on the part of the repository and lots of work that might not be available at the repository level, but that's something interesting to think about if anyone knows of any repositories who have kind of experimented with that type of research.
What we did was participating in a challenge and involving 2 production systems. So they would allow integrating the A/B testing platform that we were developing. And it was fully containerized, but what we found is that asking for fully containerized solutions from participants, we thought that it would be kind of really broad, like, oh yes, containers, Docker, yes, everybody does it, and no. So it was a high barrier for participants. It was kind of easy for the production systems to integrate the environment, really. It's just a matter of kind of plugin. You can plug in, plug out the component, but we found a high barrier for the participants with the Docker approach.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm cognizant we have 14 minutes left in our session. And I think we've had a really, really good interactive session this time with lots of comments in the chat and the notes. And also it's been great to actually speak and exchange here as we've been doing here, kind of in person, or as much in person as we can do. But does it make sense to spend the last 15 minutes or so thinking about how we move it forward? I think that was our general plan, right, Fotis? I mean, to kind of bring it together here at the end and think about what comes next.
I fully agree, and I see that already people have in the Google document have started indicating the task forces that they might be interested in contributing and participating. So what I would ask first as the next action, for those who've already filled it in, or for those who are still considering, are you interested in, beyond contributing, actually leading any of those task forces? And the reason I'm asking this very explicitly is that usually the next steps in this group is to start organizing regular calls for this task force, so that the scope and activities can be refined. Given that this is an interest group, there is not a particular time frame in any of those. So thankfully, there is not a particular pressure to conclude things, but it's always a very good practice to have something that is short-term and achievable, so that people stay engaged and not sort of fizzle out at some point. So to reintroduce the same question, would anyone be interested in sort of contributing / co-leading in the first task force, which is about the metadata enrichment? I see there are people interested. So I assume that if there are multiple numbers on the Google document, it means that they are by order of interest, decreasing order of interest, I would hope. So the first one is the more interesting one and so forth. So there are definitely people interested in task force 1. So if you feel comfortable, either unmute yourself and express interest in co-leading, or indicate this in the Google document so that we can follow up with you after. Same with task force 2, which is about the machine learning. I see that there are at least 5-6 people who are interested in as a primary focus, but my question there would be, is anyone interested in actually co-leading that? And another question that sort of comes up in that context is where we're talking about co-leadership. Essentially what it means is leading the discussions. There are not other expectations here other than being part of the discussions and leading and providing some more guided feedback on the discussion. The advantage of the co-leading here is that you have the opportunity to really drive the discussion to the topic that you feel more comfortable with. So that's the pitch talk I could give for co-leading a task force.
For this one quick question.
Please do.
Are the 3 of you who presented the topics already colleagues or you're looking for?
Right, I can answer for myself when I leave Pang and Kathleen to reply. I would be, of course, interested in contributing to the machine learning task force and help assist, co-lead, at least in the initial phases, but I don't think I'll have the capacity to actually fully lead any task force. So for my side, I'll be happy to be pushing things forward in the early stages, but I'm also happy to take a step back, if I answer the question. So Kathleen.
And I have another question. Do you have well, not a timeline yet, but kind of a starting date for these task forces? Something in mind?
I can answer that as well, again, from my point of view. Usually, given that the plenaries tend to have kind of an engagement, my response would be after the plenary, so either mid-December or early December, or at the very latest, early mid-January. I don't think that November is really a relevant point of view. I would aim for early mid-December to keep the momentum, but if not, that would be early January.
But just to echo what Foda said before, that because it is interest group and it's a task force, we're not kind of tied to the strict output deadlines that some of the other working groups and things have. So once we start, we can also define our own tasks and define our own kind of outputs, right? In our own timelines. And then just to build on what your earlier question was, Leila, I'm in the same position as Fotis. Of course, I'm very interested in user studies as well as in Task Force 1. But I would, again, have the capacity to co-lead, to help in the initial stages and drive things forward. But in terms of actually being the sole lead, that's a little bit outside of my capacity at the moment. But I'm definitely looking to collaborate on that. And Ming, now it's your turn.
Yes, I'm we have to compete each other or complement each other. Wherefore, I just to say for the task force, we just define the scope, by ourselves. We don't need to go through the RDA, the process endorsement as such, because as an interest group, we already being endorsed and conduct any activities that are covered by data discovery. So it's a very light process, and so we have Yes, scope definition activities just among ourselves. For myself, I definitely interested in all three task force, but for the moment in related to my work at LDC, so the metadata enrichment and the user study would be my priority. So at the moment, I coordinate a project that includes 3 user studies, log analysis, survey, and interview researchers. So that could be a contribution to the task force we are having here. So not necessarily, you know, it's better to have 2 or 3 people to lead. You know, rely on one person is very exhausting, time consuming. So yeah. So the more people want to join to lead, the better.
I'm going to suggest, I don't think I have seen anyone volunteering to collate here or on the document. So I'm going to suggest something. Why not you have kind of 3 breakout rooms on the next regular call for the interested group. And then from that discussion, maybe it will be easier for people to know what it is expected, kind of the feeling of the whole group, the participants. Because I am very, very interested in the machine learning, and I will be contributing to that one. Definitely, it fully aligns to a project that we are starting. But right now, I cannot even know if I can commit because I need to finish some things first. But maybe just for everybody, it would be a good idea to have that first feeling on the group that they are most interested in. And then from an initial discussion, maybe sharing who you are, et cetera, in these 3 subgroups, maybe it will be easier to find a colleague. That would be my suggestion, because we are also almost running out of time.
Thanks, Leila. I think that's an excellent idea. I think that our next planned user studies call is on November 18th. If I can put it on the chat window, November 18th. So if I recall correctly again, at 3 UTC. So what we could do is, usually we always send this as an announcement on the data discovery mailing list. So I would encourage everyone who wants to be involved in these task forces, in any of these task forces, to sign up in the mailing list. Of course, it's free. And we will set up this structure as Leila proposed on that call, so that these parallel discussions can happen and we see how much this can be moved forward. So thanks, Leila. That actually sounds like an excellent idea. Ming, is this the correct date and time? Just checking.
I'm just checking my calendar. Ooh. Probably is yes, 18th of November, 12 p.m. UTC.
12 p.m. UTC, okay.
Yeah.
That's my button. So noon UTC, basically. So if you want, just book this on your calendar. You'll get the corresponding reminder a few days before that. But if you have booked it, it might be easier for you if you'd like to join. So I think that was an excellent idea. Thanks.
If you want to get a calendar invite, probably in that collaborative notes, could you I lost my collaborative notes. So at the bottom, I just add the calendar invite. If you want to put your name there, I will add you to the calendar invite.
All right. We are 1 minute to the hour, so I don't want to keep you more than that. I think, as Catherine said, this was a very productive discussion. So many thanks for attending. The intro slides, I think they are already linked on the minutes document in the top, but if not, I will do it right now. Let me check. Yeah, if you go on the top of the minutes documents, there is a link to the folder that actually has all this information. I will explicitly link these slides as well. All right, so thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of the plenary. And I really hope I'll see some of you on the 18th for a discussion. So bye all.
Yeah. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.